Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is at long last to take a look at the final chapters of the Scarlet Letter. Now, you may notice that these end chapters have a lot to do with the beginning chapters. There's this mirroring or echoing that sort of happens. Chapter 21 is called the New England Holiday, and we have this contrast with the very opening of the book, where once again you have everybody gathered in for this big occasion. But only in the beginning, Hester was really hated by the town, and the narrator was talking about how amazing she was, though. Even as the older women were kind of clawing, being all catty at her and saying, oh, she's just getting away with things because she's pretty, the narrator was talking about how feminine she was, how much she was putting up with all of these terrible things that were happening to her, and really kind of singing her praises. But now she's unnoticed by the town. The town doesn't seem to be paying any attention. Hester's just become a part of them. And even the narrator seems a little less impressed with her as well. Now, Hawthorne here in the voice of the narrator, kind of again like he did at the very opening with the prison door, takes a little bit of time to talk about the society that is surrounding these events. So he sort of muses about the town a little bit and said this should be a real celebration day. They're electing this new governor, they're appointing these new ministers, but even though they're all from England, they don't have any of that merry old England kind of celebration anymore. The idea that the Puritans are so strict that they've lost all of the joy, that it's just easier to enforce rules and make people conform if everyone is exactly the same, and if there's all of this, just you have to follow by the rules. They mentions that the only color that's even in the crowds, the Puritans are all dressed in these traditional black and white, comes from the savages, that is the Indians who have come in from the wild, once again like we saw again at the very beginning of the story as well. And the narrator seems to be condemning the Puritans for kind of sucking all of the joy and color out of life. That's kind of what they've done to Hester and Dimmesdale's love. It's kind of what they've done to her throughout this whole book. And kind of on a larger scale, what Hawthorne is saying is that this kind of society does to people in general. Now, you'd think that Hester would be in her glory right about now. She just reconnected with Dimmesdale. They've made these plans to run away. She's got the passage aboard the ship, and then the other shoe drops. They get the bad news from the seafaring captain, who says to her, hey, guess what? You know, all of those, you booked passage the other day? Well, there's somebody else going to join you. Yay, isn't that great? And at that moment, Chillingworth smiles at her across the crowd. And Hawthorne says, that smile conveyed secret and fearful meaning. When the captain tells Hester that you've got one more berth than you bargained for, berth in this case means a place to sleep on the ship, she realizes that Chillingworth is going to follow them, that there is no escape, that in the forest she and Dimmesdale can pretend and imagine, but back here in town and in the real world, they're going to have to deal with these consequences. And right about at that moment comes Dimmesdale, and he's never looked better. The author's telling us that even among all the dignitaries, Arthur Dimmesdale is standing out. His strength seemed not to be of the body, that he's like endowed at this moment with this amazing spiritual energy. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing. The narrator mentioned that this is kind of like what happens sometimes when people are on their deathbeds and they have this one last surge of energy where they can make their confessions and say goodbye to their loved ones, and then they kind of fall back into the sickness. And, the implication is that this is what's about to happen to Dimmesdale. And they mentioned that Hester doesn't even recognize him and that she almost feels betrayed. And throughout this whole story, remember, Hester has never really said anything bad about Dimmesdale. But in this moment, it's like he's not what she had expected him to be. And even Pearl looks up and says, was that the same minister? Is that the same guy, that we were talking to by the brook? And just in case the reader thought that Hawthorne was sort of saying that, yeah, sure, you should run off with married women and go live happily ever after, we have this last encounter with Mistress Hibbins, remember, who was rumored to be the witch and the sister of, or is the actual sister of Governor Bellingham. That's not a rumor, but is rumored to be a witch. And she sort of sidles up next to Hester and say, dost thou think I have been to the forest so many times and have no skill to judge who else has been there? And Mistress Hibbins notices, again, the fact that Dimmesdale keeps his hand over his heart, and this implication that Hester and Dimmesdale have been to the woods. In other words, that they have met the devil, that that's the place where the sin takes place. And then Dimmesdale gives the sermon of all sermons. Hester can scarcely even hear what he's actually saying. She just hears this passion in his tone and this idea that the knowledge now and acknowledgement of his own sin makes him the most effective preacher anyone there has ever heard. And even Pearl seems to just come alive in the middle of this sermon. And the author uses, again, notice Hawthorne's diction here, these very specific words. He describes her as being like a bird, bright plumage, illuminates, darting, undulating. Look at the movement and the light. Vivacity, which means it's viva as in life. She's full of life. Indefatigable, I mean, she can't have there's no strength that can be taken away from her. Vibrated, active, flew, charm, beauty, eccentricity, flake of sea foam, witch baby. All of these terms are used to describe Pearl right here. And there's this little contrast between Pearl and the Indians and the sea captains, and then the rest of the Puritans who are straight and standing in one place and judgmental and all in black and white. So you have this image of Pearl with all this light and movement contrasted to the rest of the town. And just again, we have this mirror of the opening scene. We have this huge crowd gathered. They're near the scaffold. There's new people staring at Hester because all these new people have come into town. They're like, who is that person over there by herself? And what's that big letter on her chest? Pearl, once again, seems out of control. Before, when she was a baby, she was screaming. Now she's dancing all over the place. Dimmesdale's up there preaching his heart out. Roger Chillingworth is on the edge of the crowd looking on, saying, I see you. I see what's going on. And Hester clearly does not know what's going to happen left, what on earth is going, feels this trapped, what on earth is going to happen to her life. So you have, again, this mirroring of what we saw from the beginning of the novel. Chapter 23 is called The Revelation of the Scarlet Letter. And you read it, as a reader going, didn't we know about the Scarlet Letter? I mean, that's been pretty revealed for years now. And people start with thinking about Arthur Dimmesdale, and they think they've never heard a better sermon. And a little bit of irony, they think it's because he's about to die. They've known how sick he is, and they think, well, this is his, he's crossing over to the other side, and this is the light of God coming in and illuminating through him and showing all of us. But he actually feels in that moment like he's being given a new life. So even though they kind of notice that he's started to fade, that they look like, he may be on his deathbed there, he feels more alive than he has in years. And at that particular moment says he is a total triumph. Hawthorne calls him the very proudest eminence of superiority. Never had stood a man so honored. And even the idea that he's like this little angel here said a halo in the air about his head, like he's a saint in that particular moment. And finally, we come full circle. Reverend John Wilson is there again, and he's the first one who noticed that Arthur Dimmesdale has basically fallen down and is on his last legs here. And Pearl, who remember has never before, has always sort of resisted the minister, now says comes flying, again that image of movement and birds, comes flying towards him when he calls. And Roger Chillingworth tries to stop him, again being that false counselor, and says, don't tell everyone, because Chillingworth knows he has no power over Dimmesdale if Arthur Dimmesdale ever confesses, which he's about to do. And finally, Dimmesdale finds his courage and his freedom. The only way that they can escape Chillingworth is to break the power of the secret that Chillingworth has been holding over them. And Arthur Dimmesdale says, with God's help, I shall escape thee now. He calls on Hester's strength, because Hester has always had this well of strength, to free him from the clutches of Roger Chillingworth and of sin. And finally, Chillingworth says to him, hadst thou sought the whole earth over, there was no one place where thou couldst have escaped me, save on this very scaffold. So Chillingworth basically saying, I would have followed you to the end of the earth. You would never have been free. But only by confessing and getting rid of this secret can you get freedom from me. And in his dying moments, he turns to Hester and says, "Isn't this better than what we dreamed?" This life that they dreamed of that would have been based on falsehood and lies and running away, says the truth is where there's a real freedom, not in the life of a lie. And in that moment, Hawthorne tells us that the sun broke down and shone down upon the minister. And he says, "That's but a shadow of what seared into my inmost heart." And he looks like he's won a victory, even though he's about to die. And Roger Chillingworth, like the villain in the old cartoons, twirling his mustache in the corner, says, "Thou hast escaped me." So he's free. The only way that he could possibly have escaped was through the truth. And now in this moment, once again in the third scaffold scene, we have this little family group up on the scaffold. In the first one, Dimmesdale had denied that he was the father, and Hester was standing there alone with the baby. In the second one, he was there with them, but it was the middle of the night in the darkness, and as Pearl says, "Will you come back with us at noon and stand here?" And he's like, "No." But here it is now in the bright light of the sun, the three of them together as a family unit, and Pearl comes over and gives him a huge hug and a kiss and calls him, doesn't exactly call him father, but accepts him there. And Hester says as he dies that her hopes have to be for the future beyond this world. And she says, "Shall we not spend our immortal life together? Surely we have ransomed one another." In other words, the suffering that they both have should be enough to have atoned for their sin, redeemed themselves so that they can have an immortal life together. And we're told that he dies in triumphant ignominy. So that interesting contrast, ignominy here means like shame, basically. So how do you have triumphant shame? You have this nice oxymoron at the end. But in his shame of revealing that he was indeed the sinner, that he was the father of the baby, and that he's been lying to the town all these years, that's where he can be triumphant, is in the truth. And here's where Hawthorne starts to wrap up the loose endings. As people see that the Scarlet Letter that was burned onto Dimmesdale's chest, there's some interesting theories in the town. Some people think that Roger Chillingworth put it there. Some people think that it just burned its way out, that it was a devil's mark. The most likely explanation, although Hawthorne never tells us, is that Dimmesdale has been doing this to himself to punish himself. And remember, there was that bit where Chillingworth sees something on his chest when Dimmesdale is asleep. But the town still doesn't want to believe that this is the minister, and there's all of these theories and stuff that this was still something to do with Roger Chillingworth or something else. But Roger Chillingworth kind of gets written out kind of badly. Hawthorne just said, well, he had no more devil's work on earth to do, so he just dies. Cool, that's it. So Chillingworth doesn't get too much of a romantic send-off here. But we do end with some thoughts on Hawthorne's version of romanticism, the idea that you have to reveal your true self, and that love and hate can be equally powerful. It says one happens to be seen in a celestial radiance and the other in a dusky and lurid glow. And that word lurid is what was always used to describe the Scarlet Letter, that it gave off this sort of glow itself there. And we have a little epilogue, even though we don't get a lot of press given to what happens to Roger Chillingworth, just that he goes, kind of dies there, because now he doesn't have any, that the only thing that was sustaining him was this evil revenge. Now that that's gone, he has nothing worth living for. But he does have kind of a little bit of redemption in the end, because when he dies, he gives all his money to Pearl. Now remember, that's his illegitimate daughter. That's another man's son with his wife. That's somebody else who was the baby daddy. But he takes all of his fortune and he leaves it to this young girl. So there's kind of an apology in there and kind of an atonement of a sort. And then Hester and Pearl just disappear. Nobody knows where they are. Nothing's heard of them. There's rumors that spring up. There's legends that people start to say about this woman who was here with the letter. And some of them talk about the adultery, and some of them talk about the kind woman who took care of the sick, and that A for Abel sort of thoughts. And then it says many, many years later that an old gray woman appeared and glided shadow-like and takes up residence in the old cottage. And no one has gone anywhere near this cottage for all of this time. When she turns around, they can see she's still wearing the Scarlet Letter. She still has not taken it off. Remember, she even said that earlier on when the governors were talking about allowing her to take it off and being done with her sentence. She said, no, my sin put it here, and God will be the only one who can take it away. And we have these rumors. There's no official word of what's happened to Pearl. She doesn't seem to come back with Hester. Remember, Hester was never seen without this child. But he does tell us a few things, that the recluse, that would be Hester in this case, living alone in the cottage, was the subject of love and interest, with many letters and packages bearing an armorial seal, but not British. Now, armorial means a coat of arms, so in the other words, that some sort of royalty or high-ranking aristocracy, but not from Great Britain. And that Hester at one point is seen making baby clothes. And what you get are these ideas that Pearl has gone off to Europe someplace and has married really well with his fortune and is having her own children, and the idea that her mother would have been welcomed by the fire. But remember, Hester had always said that she couldn't escape, and the narrator tells us there's more real life for Hester Prynne here, that is here back in New England. And as we're closing, Hawthorne reminds us that it's kind of up to society to interpret these symbols and these sins. This A that has stood for so many different things throughout the book. And in the end of her life, Hester becomes a counselor, really helping other people. Particularly said that it was all of the older, or the sad and lonely women who had their sorrows would go to Hester for wise counsel and for comfort. And Hester kept assuring them that in time, a new truth will be revealed. And we close with the idea that after many, many years, so after a long old life, there's one grave and one stone. So Hester and Dimmesdale are buried together, but the stone itself bears the sign of the Scarlet Letter A.